Behind the farmhouse on McClung Road, the ground was uneven, soft in some places, sunken in others, like the earth there had been turned over and filled back in more than once. For years, the neighbors on the farms near Porte, Indiana, had a plain explanation for the low spots that came and went across Belle Gunness's hog lot. She was burying her garbage. That was ordinary. That was what a person did on a working farm at the edge of a small Indiana town in the early years of the century. It was not until a quiet farmer from South Dakota came to town with a spade and a question about his missing brother that anyone thought to dig. LaPorte sat in the northern part of Indiana, a county seat of a few thousand people, ringed by lakes and by flat, dark farmland. In the first decade of the 20th century, it was a stop on the rail lines, a town of brick storefronts, church steeples, and Norwegian and German immigrant families who had come west for land. The interurban trains ran out toward the countryside. Buggies stood outside the savings bank on the main street. It was the kind of place where people knew one another's business, or believed they did, and where a widow running a large hog farm alone was noticed, and mostly admired. The farm itself stood at the end of McClung Road, a little apart from its neighbors. A two-story house, a barn, a hog pen behind, an outhouse, a carriage house. Belle Gunness had bought the property with insurance money and worked it hard. She was a large, strong woman, broad through the shoulders, capable of the heavy labor a hog farm demanded. Her neighbors saw a hard-working mother of 3 young children who baked, who kept a garden, who took in the occasional hired man and the occasional visitor. What they saw was a portrait of respectable rural life. The record would later show that almost none of it was what it seemed. To understand the woman at the center of it, the record goes back to Norway, and to a name most of LaPorte never knew. She was born Brynhild Paulsdatter Sturseth in November of 1859, in the parish of Selbu, in the county of Trøndelag, in central Norway. She was the youngest of 8 children in a poor farming family. She was confirmed in the Lutheran church at 14, and went to work on the neighboring farms, milking and herding cattle, saving what little she earned for a single purpose. She wanted to go to America. Her older sister had already made the crossing and settled in Chicago, and in 1881, at 21, Brynhild followed her across the Atlantic and became, in the American style, Bella and then Belle. In Chicago, she married a fellow Norwegian immigrant named Mads Sorensen. The couple opened a small confectionery, a candy shop, and for a while they lived the ordinary life of newcomers, trying to make a footing in a hard city. Then the shop burned. Belle told the insurance company that a kerosene lamp had exploded. No such lamp was ever found in the wreckage, but the claim was paid, and the money went toward a house. There were children in those Chicago years. Some of them did not survive infancy. The recorded causes were the ordinary killers of the time: colitis and childhood illness, the sort of losses that visited many immigrant families and drew no suspicion. Only much later, when everything else was known, would anyone look back at those small graves and wonder. Several of the children had been insured. In the summer of 1900, Belle's husband Mads died at home. She said he had come in with a headache, that she had given him a dose of medicinal powder, and that when she checked on him later, he was gone. The family doctor had been treating him for a weak heart and recorded the death as a cerebral hemorrhage. There was no autopsy, because there was no suspicion. What later drew attention was a matter of dates. Mads Sorensen held 2 life insurance policies. One was expiring. One was just coming into force. There was a single day on which both were active at the same time, and that was the day he died. Belle collected on both. The relatives who suspected something said so quietly and were not heard, and the money, some $5,000, was hers. With it, she left Chicago behind. In 1901, she came to LaPorte, Indiana, and bought the farm on McClung Road, and brought her surviving daughters with her. The following spring, she married again. Her second husband was Peter Gunness, another Norwegian immigrant, a widower, and by trade a butcher and hog farmer. He was strong and experienced, and the marriage looked, on paper, like a sensible joining of 2 capable people and 1 working farm. It gave Belle the name she would carry into history. It did not last a year. Within a week of the wedding, Peter's infant daughter from his first marriage died while alone in Belle's care. The cause was never firmly established. Then, in December of 1902, Peter Gunnis himself was dead. Belle's account was specific. She said that her husband had reached for something on a high shelf in the kitchen, and that a heavy sausage grinder had fallen from the shelf and struck him on the back of the head, and that hot brine had scalded him at the same time. A meat grinder, falling just so, killing a grown man. The county held a coroner's inquest. There was open talk in Laporte that the story did not fit the injury, and one of the children in the household was later said to have told a schoolmate that Belle had killed Peter. But the girl would not repeat it under oath, and the physical evidence was ambiguous, and the coroner's jury ruled the death an accident. The record closed. Belle Gunnis was a widow for the second time, with a farm, a small son named Philip, born after Peter's death, and 3 daughters, and a growing habit that the town could not yet see. The eldest of those daughters was a foster child named Jenny Olsen. She was a bright girl, well-liked, of an age to notice things. Sometime after Peter's death, Belle began telling her neighbors that Jenny had been sent away to a finishing school in California, in Los Angeles, to better herself. Letters, Belle said, came now and then. Jenny was doing well out west. The neighbors had no reason to doubt it. Jenny Olsen was, in fact, already dead and buried on the farm. It would be years before anyone learned that the school in California had never existed. By this time, Belle Gunnis had settled into the pattern that would define her. She had a farm that needed hands, and a household that needed a man's income, or so she told anyone who asked. And she had discovered a way to bring men to her door. She began to advertise. In the matrimonial columns of the Norwegian language newspapers that circulated through the Midwest, among the German and Scandinavian immigrant communities of Chicago, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, a notice began to appear. It was addressed to a particular kind of reader, a single, older, Norwegian-speaking man, a farmer or a laborer, with some savings set aside, and no family close enough to ask questions. The wording was careful and warm. A comely widow who owned a large farm in one of the finest districts of Laporte County, Indiana, wished to make the acquaintance of a gentleman equally well provided, with a view to joining fortunes. No reply by letter would be considered, the notice said, unless the sender was willing to follow it with a personal visit. Triflers need not apply. It was an ordinary advertisement for a lonely age. Across America in those years, men and women who could not easily meet turned to the newspapers to find a match, and most of those matches were exactly what they claimed to be. What made this one different was what came after a man wrote back. Belle answered warmly, in a careful, fluent hand. She wrote of the farm, of the good soil, of the life the two of them could build together. And as the letters went back and forth, her instructions grew specific. The man should sell what he owned and settle his affairs. He should bring his money with him, in cash, not in a check or a draft that could be traced. Some accounts say she told her correspondents to sew the money into their clothing for safekeeping on the journey. And above all, he should tell no one where he was going. This was to be a private matter between the two of them, a secret, until the marriage was made. The men who followed those instructions were doing what a cautious, hopeful, unattached man might do. They were consolidating their savings for a fresh start. They were keeping a courtship quiet out of pride. What they did not know was that by the time they stepped off the train at Laporte, they had already been arranged into a form that left almost no trace, no forwarding address, no relatives who knew where to look, a pocket full of cash, and a name that no one in town would connect to anyone. The men came, and one after another, they stopped riding home. There was John Moe, of Elbow Lake, Minnesota, who answered an advertisement around 1906. He and Belle exchanged letters for months. Then he withdrew a substantial sum from his bank, more than $1,000, and traveled to Laporte to meet her. He was seen at the farm. He was said to have paid off part of her mortgage, believing he was investing in their future. Within about a week of his arrival, John Moe was gone. When his people asked after him, Belle had an answer ready. She had a great many answers ready over the years, and she delivered them without difficulty. There was Ole Budsberg, an elderly widower from Iola, Wisconsin, with 2 grown sons named Oscar and Matthew. Ole told his family nothing about the widow in Indiana. In April of 1907, he appeared at the Laporte Savings Bank, where he mortgaged his Wisconsin land, signed over the deed, and took several $1,000s in cash. That was the last confirmed sighting of Ole Budsberg alive. When his sons finally traced their father's movements and wrote to Belle Gunness, she replied without hesitation that she had never met the man. On another occasion, she said he had gone on to Oregon. The Budsberg brothers were left with a mortgaged farm, a missing father, and a widow's polite denial. There was Henry Gerholt, of Scandinavia, Wisconsin, who came to marry her and brought $1,500 to the farm. He wrote to his family soon after arriving that he liked the land, that he was in good health, and he asked them to send along some seed potatoes for the spring. That was the last they heard from him. When the family pressed Belle for word, she told them Henry had left for Chicago with a party of horse traders. A pocket watch that matched the description of Gerholt's was later found on the property, on a body that was not his to lose. There was Thomas Lindboe, who had left Chicago to work as a hired man on the farm. There was Olaf Svenherud, also of Chicago. There was a young Norwegian, newly arrived from the old country, about 30 years old, whom a neighbor remembered as a fine-looking young fellow. The neighbor asked Belle where the young man had gone, and she said he had grown tired of farm work and left for the World's Fair in St. Louis. Each disappearance had a story. Each story was plausible on its own. Only laid side by side, years later, did the pattern show itself. Not every man who came to the farm stayed forever. One left, and lived to describe it. His name was George Anderson, and he had traveled from Missouri to meet the widow he had been writing to. The visit went pleasantly enough at first. Over dinner, Belle turned the conversation to money, to the mortgage on the farm, and how it might be paid. Anderson suggested that such matters could wait until after a wedding. That night he went to bed as a guest in the house. He woke in the dark to find Belle Gunness standing over him, holding a lamp, looking down at him with an expression he could not forget and could not explain. Something in it frightened him to his core. He got up, dressed, and left the house before dawn, and he took the first train out of LaPorte, and he went home to Missouri and stayed there. For the rest of his life, George Anderson believed he had come within an hour of never leaving that farm. The record gives no reason to think he was wrong. There was one more man in the house who saw more than a visitor ever could. His name was Ray Lamphere, and Belle had hired him in the summer of 1907 as a farmhand. Lamphere fell in love with his employer. He did whatever she asked of him, however strange the chore, and there were chores that were very strange indeed. He also grew jealous. He watched the stream of well-dressed strangers arrive at the farm to court the woman he wanted for himself, and he watched them leave, or believed he did, and he began to make scenes. The last straw for Belle arrived in the winter of 1907 and 1908, and his name was Andrew Helgalian. Andrew Helgalian was a bachelor farmer from near Aberdeen, in South Dakota. He wrote to Belle in December of 1907, and the correspondence between them grew quickly intense. Belle wrote to him in her careful hand, letter after letter, and one of those letters, dated the 13th of January 1908, so moved Andrew Helgalian that he made up his mind to go to her. He drew his savings from his bank, a check for $2,900, nearly everything he had, and he traveled to LaPorte in January of 1908 to marry the widow and join his life to hers. He was there for about 2 weeks. During that time, Andrew and Belle appeared together at the savings bank in LaPorte and deposited his money into her account. The bank, and Andrew himself, suggested keeping some of it safely on deposit under his own name. Belle took it all in cash. A few days later, Andrew Helgalian was gone from LaPorte, and unlike the others, he had a brother who would not accept a story. But before that reckoning came, Belle had a nearer problem to solve. Ray Lamphere had met Andrew Helgalian, and Ray Lamphere had understood exactly what the man was there for, and he had made a scene about it. In early February of 1908, Belle fired him. Firing him was not enough. Lamphere knew too much about the farm, about the chores, about the ground behind the house. So Belle went on the offensive. She appeared at the LaPorte courthouse and declared that her former hired man was not in his right mind and was a danger to the public. She pressed for a sanity hearing. The court examined Ray Lamphere and found him sane and let him go. And so Belle tried the other door. She went to the sheriff and complained that Lamphere kept coming back to the farm to argue with her. that he threatened her and her children, and she had him arrested for trespassing. She was building a case, on paper and in the eyes of the town, that Ray Lamphere was an unstable, obsessed, dangerous man. That effort would matter enormously in a few weeks' time. Lamphere, for his part, kept coming back and kept talking. To one neighboring farmer, he let slip a line that no one understood until later. Helgelien, he said, would not bother him anymore. They had fixed him for keeps. At the time, it sounded like the bitter muttering of a jilted man. In hindsight, it was something closer to a confession. That confidence had a source, and the source was in South Dakota, growing more anxious by the week. Asle Helgelien was Andrew's brother, and when Andrew failed to come home and failed to write, Asle began to worry in a way the other families had not, or had not in time. He knew his brother had gone to Porte to meet a widow. He began writing letters. He wrote to Belle Gunnis directly, asking after Andrew. Belle wrote back with her usual composure. Andrew was not at her farm, she said. He had most likely gone off to Norway to visit relatives, or to another part of the country. Asle did not believe it. He knew his brother, and he did not think Andrew Helgelien would vanish from the face of the earth without a word, least of all after emptying his bank account. Belle tried a different tack. If Asle wished to come to Indiana and search for his brother, she wrote, she would be glad to help him look. But he should understand that searching for a missing man was expensive work, and if she were to involve herself in it, he ought to be prepared to pay her for her trouble. It was an audacious answer. It was also a stalling one, and Belle Gunnis could feel the ground shifting under her. She went to her attorney in Porte and made out a will. She arranged her affairs. She saw to it that the mortgage on the farm was paid, and in the small hours of the 28th of April 1908, the house on McClung Road caught fire. The new hired man, Joe Maxon, hired to replace Ray Lamphere, woke in his room upstairs to the smell of smoke. He opened his door to find the house already filling with flame. He called out for Belle and for the children and got no answer. He could not reach them through the fire. He climbed out and ran, and made his way into town, and roused the Porte Fire Department. But the farmhouse on McClung Road was wood and old and fast, and by the time help arrived, there was little left to save. When the ashes cooled that afternoon, searchers went down into the ruins of the basement, and there they found the dead. 3 children, identified as Belle's, Myrtle, 11 years old, Lucy, 9, and little Philip, 5. And beside them, the body of a grown woman. The woman's body had no head. The first assumption was the natural one. Belle Gunnis and her 3 children had died in a house fire, a widow and her babies caught in the night, and the first suspect was just as natural, because Belle had spent the previous 2 months making sure of it. Ray Lamphere, the obsessed and discarded farmhand who had threatened to burn her out, was arrested. He had been seen near the farm that morning. On its face, it was a tragedy with a villain already named. 2 things did not fit, and both of them refused to go away. The first was the body. A headless corpse cannot be identified by its face, and so the searchers looked at the rest. And the rest was wrong. Belle Gunnis had been a tall, powerfully built woman, something near 5 feet 8 inches and by some accounts close to 200 pounds. The dead woman in the cellar was markedly smaller, several inches shorter, and perhaps 50 or 60 pounds lighter. Neighbors and friends who came to look said plainly that the body was not Belle's. A woman that size did not shrink to that size in a fire. The second thing that did not fit arrived from South Dakota. Asle Helgelien, still searching for his brother Andrew, learned of the fire and came at last to Porte. He went to the county sheriff, Albert Smutzer, and he told him that he believed his brother had met his death at the hands of Belle Gunnis, and that the answer was somewhere on that farm. And then the new hired man, Joe Maxon, came forward with something he had not thought much of at the time. Belle had ordered him not long before to haul load after load of dirt by wheelbarrow to a fenced area behind the house where the hogs were fed. There were low depressions in the ground there, Maxon said, that Belle had told him were only filled with rubbish. On the 3rd of May, 1908, Sheriff Smutzer brought men and shovels to the hog lot on McClung Road, and they began to dig. They did not have to dig far. Just beneath the surface, in the soft ground that the neighbors had always taken for buried garbage, they found gunny sacks. And in the gunny sacks were the remains of men, dismembered and packed away, and covered over with earth and quicklime, and the ordinary refuse of a farm. The first day's digging turned up the body of Jenny Olson, the foster daughter who was supposed to be away at school in California. It turned up the small bodies of 2 unidentified children, and it turned up the remains of Andrew Helgelien, the South Dakota farmer whose brother had refused to stop asking, found in pieces in the ground where the hogs were fed. Then they kept finding more. Day after day, the sheriff's men worked the hog lot and the yard and the ground near the outhouse. A former miner named Louis Schultz, a man they called Klondike, was brought in to build a sluice, a long trough of running water like the ones used to sift gold from river gravel, so that the searchers could wash the soil and separate out human remains from the earth on a larger scale. They pulled up bones and body parts, watches, and the emptied wallets of men who had come to LaPorte with everything they owned sewn into their clothes. They found remains that matched the descriptions of the missing suitors, the watch that answered to Henry Gerholtz, the effects of men whose families had written those unanswered letters. And they found remains they could not name at all, men who had followed the instructions so completely, sold everything, brought cash, told no one, that there was no longer anyone left in the world who knew to come looking for them. At a certain point, the record simply says, the authorities stopped counting. The confirmed remains of at least a dozen people came out of that ground, and estimates of the true number climbed far higher. Some who studied the case put the toll at 14. Some put it at 20 or more. Some believed it reached as high as 40, counting the husbands, the children, and every man whose disappearance could be laid at the farm. The exact figure was never established, and it never will be, because too many of the victims had done exactly what Belle Gunness asked of them. They had erased their own trail before they ever reached her door. Where the record is silent on how many men lie unnamed in that Indiana ground, it stays silent still. What the digging did establish, beyond any doubt, was the nature of the enterprise. This had not been a crime of passion or a single dark act. It had been a business, run patiently and profitably for years, with advertising, bookkeeping, and a steady supply. Historians who have since studied the case have described Belle Gunness as one of the most prolific female killers in American history. She had used the one thing no one in that era suspected of a woman, the assumption that a widow with children and a farm was a keeper of home and hearth, and she had used it as a lure and a cover for as long as it held. The Old Widow's Ledger keeps these records one case at a time, one name at a time. Those who wish to keep reading along can follow the channel and be here for the next entry. By the late spring of 1908, the farm on McClung Road had become something the town of LaPorte had never seen. Word of the murder farm spread across the country by wire, and the curious came by the thousands. They came on the interurban trains and in buggies, and the wealthier ones came in automobiles, and boys skipped school and rode out on bicycles to watch the sheriff's men dig. By some estimates, 10 to 15,000 people passed through in those weeks. Vendors set up along the road and sold ice cream and popcorn and postcards printed with images of the excavation. There was reportedly a stew sold to the crowds under the grim name of the woman herself. A local photographer documented the evidence, the ground, the recovered effects, in pictures that survive in the county's archives to this day. It was horror, and it was carnival at once, and it fixed Belle Gunness in the American imagination under a shelf of nicknames the newspapers coined for her. Hell's Belle, Lady Bluebeard, the mistress of the murder farm. But the question the crowds had come to gawk at was the same one the investigators could not answer. Whose was the headless body in the cellar? If it was not Belle Gunness, then Belle Gunness was alive, and had murdered a woman to leave in her place, and had set the fire, and had walked away from LaPorte, a free and wealthy woman, while the town buried a decoy in her name. The coroner needed proof one way or the other. Belle's dentist, a man named Norton, said that if any of her dental work could be recovered, he could identify it with certainty. And so Klondike Schultz and his sluice were set to washing the cellar debris, and on the 19th of May, a piece of bridgework was recovered from the ashes. 2 human teeth, with their roots still attached, joined by porcelain and gold crownwork. The dentist examined it and declared it to be the work he had done for Belle Gunness. On the strength of that bridgework, the coroner, Charles Mack, ruled officially that the headless woman in the basement was Belle Gunness, and that she had died in the fire. The ruling closed the case on paper. It did not close it in the minds of the people who had seen the body. The teeth had been found late, after the question had already been raised, and in the exact spot where a woman intent on faking her own death would have known to leave them. The body was still the wrong size. The neighbors still shook their heads. And so, alongside the official record, a second belief took root and never died, that Belle Gunness had planned her own disappearance down to the last detail, had procured a woman's body, had removed its head to prevent identification, had set her own house alight with her children inside it, and had vanished into the enormous, anonymous country with the fortune she had spent years collecting. That left Ray Lamphere. In November of 1908, the jilted farmhand was tried at the LaPorte County Courthouse. The jury convicted him of arson for setting the fire, but acquitted him of murder. It was a split verdict that satisfied no one completely, and it left the central mystery exactly where it had been. Lamphere was sent to the state prison. He did not live long there. He died of tuberculosis a little over a year later, and in his final months, according to accounts given afterward by a fellow inmate and by a clergyman who attended him, Ray Lamphere talked. He said that Belle Gunness had not died in the fire at all. He said the woman in the cellar was another victim, lured to the farm and killed to serve as a stand-in. He said Belle had set the plan in motion and slipped away, and that he had helped her, and that she was alive somewhere with her money. How much of this to believe is a matter the record leaves open. Lamphere was a dying man, with reasons to embellish and reasons to unburden himself, and no one has ever been able to prove or disprove what he claimed. It fits the evidence of the body. It cannot be confirmed. What followed was decades of ghosts. For years, reported sightings of Belle Gunness surfaced across the country. A woman answering her description glimpsed in one town or another, running a boarding house, keeping to herself, watching the door. One such report placed her in Mississippi as late as 1931, more than 20 years after the fire, when Belle would have been in her 70s. None was ever confirmed. In 2008, a century after the fire, researchers exhumed the headless body from its grave and attempted to compare its DNA against a sample taken from a letter Belle had sent to one of her victims. The material was too old and too degraded to yield a clean answer. The test that might have settled it, one way or the other, gave nothing. The farm on McClung Road is gone now. The house never stood again. The County Historical Society in LaPorte keeps what remains: the coroner's records, the transcribed inquests over the men who were pulled from the hog lot, a salvaged wall from one of the farm's sheds covered edge to edge with the carved names of the tourists who came to stare in 1908, and a small, quiet collection of the objects that outlived everyone in the story. The names that could be recovered are recorded there: Andrew Helgelian, Ole Budsberg, John Moe, Henry Gerholt, Jenny Olson, and beside them, in the same ledger, the unnamed. The men listed only as unidentified, the ones who sold everything and told no one, and boarded a train to Indiana, and whose people never knew where to look, and whose true number no one living will ever count. The court records do not say how many men lie in that ground. The coroner's ruling says Belle Gunness died in the fire. The neighbors who knew her said otherwise. Between those two accounts, more than 100 years later, the case still sits, unsettled, exactly where the digging left it.